What is it like for an INFJ to experience imposter syndrome? And more specifically, what experience with regard to imposter syndrome do different kinds of INFJ have? Because if we assume that there are different types of INFJ, which there are, and I've been sketching them, over the last few years in my books and my videos, it's kind of tempting to assume that depending on the kind of family of INFJ that you belong to, your relationship or not to imposter syndrome is going to differ. Now, this question was originally asked for by CL Strife. I thank her for that. This actually led me to posit the existence of a fourth subtype of INFJ. And I will only be mentioning that fourth subtype of INFJ in this video, and I'll be, telling you, or I'll be sort of looking forward to exploring that new subtype or that additional subtype of INFJ in a future video, maybe next video, and hopefully you'll be interested in that too. But I must kind of give you an indication of what that is in this video as well, and why CL Strife's question about imposter syndrome actually led me to realize that we might have to posit the existence of this fourth subtype. Briefly, on methods, you remember I always like to talk about the fact that my theory is bottom up. In some ways, it's a bit similar to Freud's, although Freud was a mix of top down and bottom up. But Freud was consistently updating his theory across his career and, coming up with new concepts, then getting rid of those concepts, adding new ones. For example, we've all heard of what the superego is. Well, it comes from Freud, but we keep in mind that Freud started to write books, influential books, in the late 19th century. Yes. He only came up with the concept of the superego or put it to paper in like 1923 or something like that. So it's a gradual process, and it's the same for me, particularly because it is empirical, bottom up, linked to my experiences and to your feedback too. So the existence of this fourth subtype, I think, is just arising out of a need to meet certain difficulties linked with experiential evidence. So imposter syndrome, and then we'll return to this, right? Imposter syndrome is something that a lot of people have experienced, but it's not something that everybody experiences. And in the same way, it's something that a lot of INFJs are going to experience, but not all INFJs are going to experience it. Among the INFJs that do not experience it, of course, you will find the spiritualized or liberated INFJ. But the problem with this is that it should be possible to also imagine that there is a kind of INFJ personality that never experiences imposter syndrome, and doesn't have to go through a whole journey of development from like an adaptive stage to a solipsistic stage to a spiritualized stage in order to stop experiencing imposter syndrome. Like, there are INFJs who simply do not experience imposter syndrome. And the reason for that is that imposter syndrome, this is partly my theory, but it's linked to, psychoanalytic theories and knowledge that I want to share with you. First of all, consider the idea that there's a difference between self-esteem and self-confidence. And the way you can think about it is, self-esteem is directly related to the consolidation, the constitution of your ego. If you have a well-organized, well-constructed, completed ego, and this is very much dependent on your experience of childhood, your different psychosexual stages, relationship to your caregivers, and so on. Self-esteem is posited, in fact, by many psychoanalysts these days, to be really related to the very first years of life. And essentially, arising out of these first years of life is this notion that your ego is going to be sturdy enough to, later on relate to others in a way that does not let others have too much of an influence over how they and their perception, or your perception of their perception, defines who you are. So someone who has strong self-esteem is not that dependent on the views of others, okay? They tend to not be threatened by the views of others. Now, self-confidence is slightly different. It's linked in psychoanalysis to slightly later stages of the child's development. It's often more so linked to what's referred to at the anal stage and as the relationship with the father, whereas self-esteem is more so related to the relationship with the mother. I won't go into a lot of detail about this here, but just try to keep this in mind. And self-confidence has more to do with action rather than being. So self-esteem has to do with how you feel about how you are. Self-confidence has to do with how you feel about what you do. And therefore, the idea here is that someone who's self-confident is someone who feels good about being good at acting on certain things. So if they have a certain set of skills, if later in life they have a particular job they're really good at, activities they're good at, that will tend to reinforce them. It will seem to project strong self-esteem, but actually it's separate. Self-confidence varies more, it fluctuates more than self-esteem does. It's a bit more brittle, right? It's a bit more precarious. An amazing sports person, an amazing athlete who has to go into retirement, well, sometimes, they experience depressions, or, they experience serious mental issues. You could think of that. It's one possibility to think of it in terms of, well, the conduit that used to give them all that self-confidence and, push them to push themselves is no longer as active as it used to be. And they're left with maybe a self-esteem that's actually not quite up to scratch. So the idea then would be something like, if you have imposter syndrome, you're someone who probably doesn't have very high self-esteem because you depend on the views of others, particularly about your level of skill. And therefore, someone who's heavily dependent for how they perceive themselves on, how they are perceived for their competence, are going to experience it in imposter syndrome, particularly in the first few months or years of being in a job that they have to learn. You have to learn the job, so you kind of have to accept that you're not going to be excellent at it straight away. And someone who has self-esteem will be able to negotiate that anxiety, will be able to negotiate those concerns and think to themselves reasonably straightforwardly, well, I need to get better at this because I'm just starting, and they won't be harried by those thoughts. Whereas someone who places all the emphasis on the self-confidence that accrues to having good skill is basically going to be left during those first formative years of being at a job, say, just with their low self-esteem, because their self-confidence won't have appeared yet because they'll feel like they're not competent. So you see how that is linked to the imposter syndrome. An INFJ who is going to experience this particular imposter syndrome is not primarily an INFJ that lacks self-confidence. It's an INFJ who lacks self-esteem and is therefore dependent on the self-confidence of feeling like they are really competent at something. But when you start something, you're not competent, or not yet completely competent, and so you're going to immediately move to what you are, and that's the low self-esteem kicking, sort of knocking at the door and saying, well, if I'm not really good at this yet, or if I'm not completely responding to all the needs that accrue to this position yet, it must have to do with me. It must have to do with the fact I'm an imposter. Okay, and so in the end, this imposter syndrome is not going to be a definitive trait of INFJs more than it is of any other type, because again, it much more has to do with your childhood and how you were raised and how you responded to your caregiver's love, or perceived a lack of affection, or lack of being present for you at particular junctures, and that can have a very, very strong influence on your relationship to your self-esteem, to your image of self, and to your self-confidence later on. But I would say that what led me to think that there must be a fourth subtype of INFJ is precisely that clearly the adaptive submissive and the solipsist are both types that are going to experience imposter syndrome, because they're both types that put a lot of stock by the way they're perceived by others. One in a very sort of direct fashion, the adaptive, and not one that is done through what in psychoanalysis sometimes called reaction formation. That is to say that you adopt a posture that seems to imply the opposite of what you're really feeling. So, for example, the adaptive submissive liking to claim that they don't care about what people think, that they don't need other people, but through the very rejection of those people is implied the fact that they still depend very much on how they're perceived, right? They're perceived. In fact, one way of thinking about it is that the way they're perceived by others can be so easily hurtful to them that they choose to devalue interacting with other people and devalue other people as not worth spending time with and so forth. So you see, that's where things get tricky. There has to be a kind of INFJ that is defined by having had such a childhood that they have pretty good self-esteem and won't experience imposter syndrome. Who are these INFJs? That's what I want to discuss in my future video. If you want to hear more about this, give me a like if you enjoyed the video. If it challenged your perceptions, let me know in the comments. You know that I've written 2 books on the INFJ, The Infinite Soul, INFJ Life in the Modern World, and how INFJs can find happiness, purpose, and value in a world that is often hostile. I look deeper into all those topics of how INFJs can interact with the external world, with reality in a way that makes them flourish. The previous book, The Ecstatic Soul, is about the inside of the INFJ mind, a deep, deep analysis, the deepest you'll find of how INFJ consciousness functions and what it's like to be an INFJ. And as I like to say, my Patreon page is the lifeblood of my channel. My Patreon supporters are really the lifeblood of my channel. Please consider donating to my channel at the link below to my Patreon. You can interact with me there. You can suggest video content for me to cover, and you get bonus videos as well. I'm aiming to have that done every 2 weeks or so, usually in-depth discussions of topics from my books. Okay, consider it, and I'll talk to you next time, guys. Bye-bye.